I really took a lot of time, especially during the sabbatical, when I was asking myself, what would it look like to leave? Understanding what my fears were that were holding me back. One of them was, am I going to lose my sense of community, the connections I've built through this work? Am I going to not have a thing I'm known for? Or should I just be known as Amber? What does being a whole self look like? And by thinking through these things early, I was able to create some strategies and some plans. Not perfect, but giving myself opportunities to work through them.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Amber Melanie Smith. Amber, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with you giving a little introduction to yourself and what brings you to our conversation today.
Where to begin? So going back way back, I started a nonprofit before I finished college, grew it to multiple team members and mobilizing over 50,000 people in my city of Raleigh, North Carolina. And then fast forward about 19 years, just left that position 2.5 months ago as the founder and executive director of the nonprofit. So long journey, here I am.
Yeah. Okay. Can you talk us through? So one of the ways that I got particularly excited about having this conversation was you sharing about stepping down out of your role. And as I am sure you are familiar with, a big challenge that a lot of organizations face is the transition out of their first founder. Whether that happens at a 3-year mark, whether that happens at a 30-year mark, there's a lot that goes into that. And so first, I'd just love for you to share some of your own kind of thinking and orientation to what led you to that decision. And then maybe we can get more into the kind of messy middle.
Yeah, it was a lot of personal stuff and some organizational realizations as well. And I would say I first started asking myself the question, is it time? Should I think about leaving this role? Maybe 2-ish years ago, we had a wonderful volunteer who was doing some pro bono leadership development with our organization. And part of that was a personality test. I don't know if you've ever heard of the OAD. I hadn't before I took the test. I'm not even sure what that stands for, actually. Organizational something. But the test is supposed to provide a snapshot of how people are feeling they're fulfilling their role in that specific moment in time. And it does this by asking how you feel what personality traits are coming to the surface in your role and what personality traits are the most true to your personality as you see it. And the goal is, do they align, right? You want to see, are you bringing your whole self to the role is the main question. I took the test and submitted my results. And a couple days later, this volunteer emailed me. He said, I normally don't do this, but I'd love to have a meeting with you about your results. So I meet with him and he says, based on your results, it looks like you're about to implode in this organization. And what that meant, of course, based on how I just described the test, was there was some kind of misalignment with how I viewed my whole self and who I needed to show up as in the organization. And I'd been feeling something was off, but I hadn't really quite known how to describe it. And this was, of course, also at the tail end of the pandemic. So we are all tired. We'd been running on adrenaline, as many nonprofit leaders had throughout that whole period, and had just started to come down. And when you come down from exercise or anything stressful, you're just tired. So it was like prolonged fatigue. But I had never asked myself that question before, and it was too scary to even say out loud or in my head. So I didn't. I kind of put his commentary to the side. I ignored it for a while. Months went on, and I started to experience some very strange physical symptoms. The fatigue was heightened, but I also found myself in my doctor's office doing a mental health assessment with her. And if you've ever done this, you go in and they give you a chart and you check off how many times per week do you feel anxiety? How many times per week do you feel depressed, etc. And I noticed that I kept marking 3 to 4 days per week. So over half the week, I was feeling all of these things. And I thought something was just physically wrong with me. We did a blood test, noticed that my B12 was low, and sent me off with some vitamins. So I ignored that as well. But then, long story shorter, I came to a point where I just couldn't. My body just refused. And I asked my executive committee on our board for a sabbatical last year. They graciously granted me a sabbatical. I took 2 months where I was just able to rest, do things related to my whole self, like art, music, love on my dog, etc. And that was when the question really was able to be asked and considered. So that was kind of a long answer, but hopefully I took you through that timeline there.
Well, you know what first of all, I really appreciate you sharing really vulnerably about your own sort of journey and the personal and professional sort of components that were coming together. I also really appreciate you sharing how you ignored the signs, honestly, because I think that we all have been there. We all have done that. Like whatever breaking point, I just got a message on LinkedIn from somebody recently talking about this sort of like big breaking point wake up call that she's had. And it's just made me realize, like, I don't know, I think there's a part of us that feels like if we've ignored it for a certain amount of time, we should just kind of keep ignoring it, because almost then we have to acknowledge that like we were ignoring it before. And so I just think there's something really brave about saying like, yeah, someone told me this before and I like kept going. And then this other thing happened and I also kept going. And then it all kind of came together and I was able to like integrate all of it, because I think the reality is that these things are way messier, than they look like once we put them up online and we're in our, whatever place we're in of clarity. Getting there was likely really hard. And so I'm curious if you're willing to share, like in that process for you, was there any more kind of like back and forth around like, maybe I'm not ready, or maybe I could make this more aligned with me, or maybe like kind of the negotiation with self?
Absolutely. And especially as a founder, when you start an organization, you kind of just assume you're going to be there forever, right? And there's a lot of guilt that comes with even daring to ask the question. For me anyway, like some founders are smart and they go in knowing that they are going to have an exit strategy at some point. But this was my calling when I was in college. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my dog snoring in the background. So the guilt holds you back from asking the questions. But then you realize, if I'm feeling this way organizationally, how's that impacting the mission I love so much too, right? When I started to think about it, ironically, outside of myself, it helped me come into focus too, because the conclusion I ultimately came to was I started this organization, I grew it, and maybe one of the reasons I'm feeling the misalignment I've been feeling is because I was the right type of leader for that phase of the organization. But maybe a different kind of leader is needed for the next phase. And I can honor what I created by passing it off. And personally, I can figure out how to make an impact in another way if I leave and open myself up to that. So for sure, lots of self-negotiation. And even when I returned from the sabbatical a couple weeks afterwards, I still wasn't 100% sure. I wanted to see what it felt like to be back after I'd rested. And a couple weeks in, I still felt the question. I still realized the organization needs something different and I need something different. And that's when I approached my board chair to make a plan.
Okay, there's so much here. I'm like, where do we dig in further? I'm curious, like, now that you've made that transition, what's it been like for you? Like, how did the sort of emotions or maybe fears of what you thought it might look and feel like, how did they actually relate to what your experience was once you started to move through it?
So I'm an overthinker, which I think weirdly helped me in this situation, because I did a pre-mortem, which means you're thinking about everything that could go wrong before it goes wrong and coming up with a plan to mitigate it. So when I first approached my board chair, we pulled out a succession plan that we thankfully had already written a couple of years before that, just as a good practice. We mapped our timeline to the succession plan. We thought of everything that could go wrong, who might be most upset by the news. how am I going to approach them? So the transition itself was very carefully thought through with those things in mind. For me personally, I really took a lot of time, especially during the sabbatical, when I was asking myself, what would it look like to leave? Understanding what my fears were that were holding me back. One of them was, am I going to lose my sense of community, the connections I've built through this work? Am I going to not have a thing I'm known for? Or should I just be known as Amber? What does being a whole self look like? And by thinking through these things early, I was able to create some strategies and some plans. Not perfect, but giving myself opportunities to work through them. Like I make it a practice to text some of my contacts and friends from my old space regularly to stay in touch. Newsletters in the community to see what events are going on where I can plug in. I'm going to volunteer, for some of the nonprofits that I partnered with back in when I was working with my organization. So I think knowing yourself and assessing your reasons that would hold you back from leaving, even when you know leaving might be the best thing for you, can help you work through some of that.
Okay, there's also something in there that I just really want to commend you around and sort of highlight for folks listening, which is like the ability to acknowledge those fears to yourself, right? Like I think some of what you're talking about here requires a level of like self-awareness to be able to even name, like, I'm afraid of how this will impact how I'm remembered. I'm nervous about this, the relationship between this and my identity. Though being able to even have that conversation with yourself is so important and really like takes an openness and a curiosity of self that it sounds like then really gave you the space to explore honestly with yourself what the next step could or should look like. Does that feel true?
It does. And we also need to be asking ourselves these questions in the work too, not just at the end of it.
Totally. Yes. Is that one of your, like when you were talking before about sort of maybe ignoring some earlier signs, do you wish that, or were you asking yourselves these questions like in your work? Or do you feel like there's some of these that you're like, ooh, if I had maybe been able to ask myself these questions a little bit earlier, I maybe could have heard that advice when it came up earlier?
I think that's possible. Throughout COVID, especially, there was a heightened sense of duty. Like, I can't possibly abandon my organization now, like that sort of talking to yourself. And that's part of the guilt of leadership, worrying about leaving your post and the mission, especially during a time when the needs were greater across the board. But I think to your point, for sure, if I'd been able to ask myself some of those questions, but also think of some of the answers to the questions earlier, because in their first stage, they were just fears. They weren't fears that were mitigated. They were only fears, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. I want to ask something that is a little bit sensitive. And so you can tell me if you do not want to answer it. That is totally fine. But I've thought a lot about the leader that I used to be in different organizations. And one of the things that has been really hard for me personally was really hard for me to sort of accept at first were the ways in which I like martyred myself for the mission. And the way in which that led to resentment, it led to a lack of boundaries. For me, it led to total collapse and chronic pain and all the things. And that piece around duty is like, there's this nuance there, right? Like I also didn't leave an organization during COVID. I was in a fundraising role, but I was like, I don't want to leave them high and dry during COVID. I feel like that feels like an important sort of moral consideration for me to make. And like, how do we identify the line between that and maybe the sort of like duty or responsibility that we feel with like when we are entering territory? And I'm not saying you were in this territory. I'm saying I was in this territory where we have then sort of made duty feel like we don't have choice around it. And in doing so, we kind of become a martyr to our mission. And I feel like that's what gets a lot of leaders stuck in roles like this, when really the best thing they can do for the organization is to transition out, but they're so kind of like emotionally bound to it in that way that it's hard to see that.
Yeah. So I think if you are inclined to have that mentality or orientation of martyrdom, right? Then one effective thing you can do to help yourself with that is to acknowledge that a tired, resentful leader is not a good leader, right? And so if you really have to come up with an external reason to fuel your transition, know that if you're sitting there upset, angry, and tired, you're not being an effective ambassador and champion for your mission anyway. So you're actually doing it a disservice by staying. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn as well, but I'm happier now.
Yeah. I mean, you said the word guilt earlier too. Like, what's that process? What was that process like for you of sort of like navigating or like pulling those pieces apart?
For me, I had a couple of people I really trusted to talk through my feelings with and who were able to give me some perspective from an outside view. Some people within the nonprofit space who knew what it was like, and some people without. So synthesizing all of their feedback together, I think really helped assuage some of that guilt.
Okay, what would you tell? I think you've already sort of answered this a little bit, but if you were going to give a founder like 3 questions to ask themselves, let's say they're feeling really burnt out and like just that they're experiencing a lot of friction in their role, but they maybe don't feel like they even have the space to think about what's next. What's maybe 1 to 3 reflection questions you'd have them start with just to start building more of an introspective relationship with themselves?
One thing is, and I would say this is a question for founders and honestly anyone doing this work or thinking of doing this work, and that is to really know yourself and know what you need in a work style and a work environment. I learned about myself that I'm best suited to a startup environment. I love the energy and a little bit of the chaos involved in that phase. I love building. I love creating. I love innovating. I'm not the person you want to maintain sustainability, to manage a large, more bureaucratic or structured organization. That's not me. And so if you find yourself as a triangle trying to fit in a position that's a circle, even if that position used to be a triangle, then having the self-awareness to observe what the environment is around you and if it aligns with what you need is very important. And some of that's going to be in your control and some of it's not. You know, in my case, it was a good thing that the organization had matured. It meant I did a good job in the first phase. And so that's the other thing is look around at what you have accomplished and honor that as well, right? I'm terrible at celebrating success. I had to have people tell me, stop, slow down, celebrate what has been accomplished. And it's not just for me. It was for the team too, right? Because if I'm moving fast, always on to the next thing, they don't get to appreciate and celebrate and have that boost of morale for themselves, even if I'm ready to move on.
Okay, so you made this leap into the unknown for you and made this decision for your organization without knowing your next steps, which I love personally. And I think it's really hard because usually if we're in a state of overwhelm, doing something that increases our uncertainty, like when we're in fear or overwhelm or paralysis, right? We like want to grip hard to control. And you were like, I'm going to actually increase my own personal uncertainty in this way and do something really brave. How did you get yourself to do that?
I think my answer is also a good third question for founders to ask themselves. And it is, what's your personal mission, right? What I realized was that before I started my organization, I had a personal mission that led me to start it, and that personal mission actually hadn't changed. It was just the clothing it was going to wear changed, right? So my personal mission is to activate and equip change makers to succeed in making an impact. I love seeing the look on someone's face when they realize for the first time that they have agency to make a change. right? That's magical to me. I live for that. That's what I did in my old organization. I'm in terms of mobilizing people to volunteer in my community. And now I'm moving towards just helping activate change makers of all kinds, whether they're starting or growing a nonprofit, working in the space, social entrepreneurship, maybe running for public office, any ways that you can create positive change. I want to help you find the path to get there. So having that at my center reduced some of that anxiety, because even if I didn't know exactly what specific activities or jobs or projects I was going to do around that, I knew that that was my mission and my ultimate outcome.
So it sounds like there was some hope there for you, of like, there was both this recognition of the emotions and the experience you were having around changing your relationship to this organization, but also a focus on the hope of what it would look like to live a really aligned life, doing something that fulfills that personal mission and allows you to do this thing that you love more.
And not just that, but design the schedule and the lifestyle that I want that can also match that mission, right? So that complete autonomy is very helpful and incentivizing.
Yes, I envy consultants or anyone who has done a good job of that. I always get way too excited and end up having, packed schedule. People are always like, oh, do you have more flexibility? And I'm like, no, I do not. But I think that's awesome. And I think just the sort of recognizing the areas in which you have choice and opportunity and leaning into those and doing like enough personal regulation and awareness to not have your discomfort around this transition stop you from moving forward. I just think you're modeling in all of this a lot of like what I almost want people to sort of hear this as like a case study a little bit, because I think that I deserve zero credit for, not like a case study for me, but just like a really incredible example of what it looks like to navigate, to make a hard decision, to be introspective, to give yourself time and permission to change your mind, to then start to have hard conversations with yourself, work with the right people at the table to create a tangible plan, and then walk yourself through and towards uncertainty, focused on what could be on the other side with love and appreciation for what has been, that it didn't have to be this thing where it was like, oh gosh, like I gotta, it was so wrong that I've been leading this organization. It was like, no, like I was the right leader for that moment. That was the right thing at the right time. And now it's time for a change. And so I really hope people are listening to your journey and seeing what's possible for them, even if it's not leaving a founder position. But I think it's just a beautiful example of what personal evolution and growth look like in relationship to professional evolution and growth. So I'm really grateful for your willingness to share your story.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, just know that you're going to do your best where you feel most aligned. And if you can just remember that, then hopefully that removes any guilt that would come with a decision to go here or there. You're going to make the most impact if you're rested and passionate and excited about what you're doing.
Yes. Okay. That is the perfect note to leave everyone on. Tell them where they can go to learn more about you, connect with you and your new work.
Absolutely. I am educating people on social impact on YouTube. So you can find me by typing in my name, Amber Melanie Smith, and my new website, changemakercafe.com.
How fun is that? Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much, Amber, for your time. I'm so grateful for this conversation.